Hey guys, tonight we slip softly into the lantern-lit hush of ancient Kyoto. Paper screens whisper closed. A bamboo water fountain clacks somewhere in the garden. You can almost smell the distant incense of sandalwood and ink as you wander into a palace where everyone speaks in poetry and even heartbreak is written on scrolls. This is the world of Lady Murasaki, real name unknown, who lived over 1,000 years ago and without even trying, may have invented the modern novel. You're going to follow her from curious childhood to court intrigue, from the quiet agony of widowhood to the literary coup of the millennium. But fair warning, it involves a lot of waiting, a ton of diary writing, and several layers of emotional repression. You probably won't survive this without tea. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love reading those. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step softly over the floorboards of 10th century Japan, where slippers barely whisper and elegance is everything. The capital is Heian-era today's Kyoto city, laid out in perfect grids, just like China's great capitals. But unlike Chang'an or Luoyang, Kyoto is not a city of noisy markets and shouting hawkers. This place hums gently. You pass rustling robes and courtiers who speak in carefully crafted syllables, as though each sentence is a little sculpture. In the innermost layers of the palace, you meet the Fujiwara family. Picture power brokers in silk. They don't rule from thrones, they rule by marrying their daughters into the imperial line and whispering in the ears of emperors. And it's into one branch of this family that Murasaki is born around the year 973, though we don't know exactly when. Or even her real name. See, in Heian, Japan, respectable women don't use their actual names in public. They're referred to by court titles, family connections, or the positions of male relatives. So what we call Murasaki Shikibu is more of a placeholder. Murasaki comes from a character in her own novel, the literary equivalent of naming yourself after your OC. Shikibu just refers to her father's job in the Ministry of Ceremonial Affairs. Historians still argue whether she was deliberately hiding her identity or just playing by the rules. But either way, you won't be calling her Mariko or Kaori tonight. She'll remain simply Lady Murasaki. You walk past her childhood home, not a mansion, but a modest Kyoto compound, probably with sliding doors that open to a tidy gravel garden. Her father, Fujiwara no Tamatoki, is a minor scholar and court official. Not at the top of the Fujiwara pyramid, but high enough to get her educated. Which, for a girl, is unusual. Not forbidden exactly, more like discouraged with a polite cough. And yet, Murasaki is that kind of kid, the one who watches everything, listens when adults don't think she's paying attention, and tugs at scrolls she's not supposed to read. While her peers learn the art of perfume blending or composing 31-syllable poems, she's devouring Chinese classics like the Analects and records of the Grand Historian. Most girls are expected to read only Japanese kana. Murasaki gets her hands on kanji too, the stuff of serious boys' education. At one point, her father reportedly sighs, "What a pity she's not a boy." You hear that and it sticks with you, like a tiny rejection folded neatly into a compliment. She's praised for being brilliant, just not brilliant in the right gender. Outside, you hear the lull of Kyoto life ox carts rolling, monks chanting, and the occasional bang of thunder as summer storms roll down from the mountains. Inside, Murasaki probably scribbles little stories in secret, or copies out Chinese poems to memorize under her breath. Maybe she even invents characters and gives them lives, marriages, and tear-streaked deaths, because why not? You're stuck inside most of the time anyway. High-end society is obsessed with appearances. You're judged on handwriting, scent, and the elegance of your sleeves. Women live most of their lives behind screens or curtains, only glimpsed by men during brief scripted encounters. And even those often happen at night. Want to know what your lover looks like? Wait until the third visit. Maybe they'll let you peek. There's a dark comedy in all of it. One Heian noblewoman is dumped because the way she coughed wasn't poetic enough. Another sends a suitor a fan smeared with perfume and a poem about dew, only to get ghosted. Murasaki watches all of this with a dry smile. She sees the pageantry, but also the absurdity. She also watches her mother die while she's still young. There's a kind of silence around it. Heian diaries are full of passive grief, like emotion filtered through mulberry paper. No wailing, just a woman's presence slowly vanishing from a household. You don't see her funeral. You just notice that her name stops appearing in poems. And so, Murasaki grows up in a home that values books and beauty, but still reminds her where her place is. She won't inherit anything. She won't run anything. But she will watch everything. And she'll remember. Oh, will she remember? As the capital turns with the seasons, cherry blossoms in spring, fireflies in summer, red maple in fall, you watch her childhood narrow into a sort of velvet box. Pretty, yes, comfortable, sure. But closed, and from inside that box she starts to write. You sit cross-legged on a tatami mat, quietly watching her. A teenage girl, too clever for the room she's in, delicately holds a writing brush between her fingers. Outside, a breeze rattles the paper screens and someone is pounding a rice in the distance. But she doesn't flinch. She's tracing out kanji with the kind of steady focus that would make any Heian tutor proud or uncomfortable, depending on whether they think girls should be doing this at all. Her name? Still off limits. You won't hear it. But you know her by her eyes sharp, observant, a little tired. She notices the way people shift when they lie. She hears the hesitations in polite conversation. She knows how to make her face blank, serene, even as her mind gallops in every direction. Her world is bound by etiquette. Want to speak to a man? Do it through a screen. Want to express sadness? Write a waka poem. Want to scream because you're smarter than half the men at court, but no one wants your opinion? Nope, no poem for that. You trudge alongside her through the rhythms of an elite Heian girl's life. Morning hair combing ceremonies, incense games, endless scroll copying, and, of course, practicing calligraphy. There's something intensely poetic about this existence, sure, but also stifling. Like someone turned your whole life into a very polite hostage situation, but with more poetry slams. Still, she finds her rebellions, little ones. She copies Buddhist sutras, but sometimes slips in Chinese prose that's considered too masculine for women. She debates metaphors with her father at dinner. She even scandalously laughs too loudly once at a poetry contest. And at night, when the lamps are trimmed low and the shadows soften into each other, she lies awake composing stories in her head. Not just poems, stories. With characters who speak in more than 5 lines, who make terrible decisions and pay dearly for them. Her mind is a paper theater, scenes folding open like little fans. And it's addictive. What does she dream of? That's the thing, probably not fame. Maybe not even publishing. This is an era where women's talents are appreciated only if they serve beauty or the court. But Murasaki has a different instinct. Observation. She doesn't dream of ruling. She dreams of understanding why people ruin the things they love. Now, look again at the society forming her. Heian Japan is obsessed with refinement. A noble woman is expected to compose poetry about dew in the morning and mourn blossoms when they fall. And Murasaki can do all that, sure. But she's also peeking behind the curtain. She sees the cruelty under the beauty, the loneliness inside the elegance. She sees that even the best perfume can't cover up regret. Quirky tidbit for the night? Well, did you know Heian courtiers judge potential lovers partly on the handwriting of their love notes? Imagine your dating profile being analyzed by a monk with a brush and a taste for aesthetic drama. One nobleman reportedly broke up with a woman because her penmanship was too assertive. That's the kind of energy you're dealing with here. And Murasaki, her handwriting is said to be exquisite, controlled, elegant, modest, but hiding a razor behind every curve. Her father, Tamatoki, is soon posted to a provincial governorship likely in Ekizen, up north, cold and boring. Murasaki is left behind, possibly with relatives or in Kyoto under careful surveillance. He'll later try to get her a court position, which is both helpful and frustrating. Murasaki doesn't want to be a court lady, exactly. She wants to write. But women with ambitions don't get to choose their jobs. They get maneuvered like shogi pieces on a board they can barely see. Meanwhile, she gets married. To a distant relative, possibly a man named Fujiwara no Nobutaka. He's older, not terribly romantic. Some scholars think the marriage was short and uninspired. Others think she genuinely grieved when he died a few years later. Historians still argue whether Murasaki wrote parts of Genji as a kind of mourning or revenge. But one thing is certain. After she's widowed, she doesn't remarry. That's already unusual in Heian, Japan, where alliances and remarriages are common. Murasaki seems to take this moment, this vacuum of expectation, and lean into it. Quietly, strategically. She now has a daughter, Daini no Sanmi, who will also grow up to become a poet at court. You imagine the two of them sitting together in a candlelit room, the mother correcting her daughter's poems, suggesting a different image for moonlight, sharpening metaphors like she's grinding a blade on stone. There's tenderness here, but also something that feels like legacy building. As she moves into her late 20s or early 30s, a mature age for a Heian noblewoman, Murasaki begins crafting something larger than a diary, not just another poem or court record, something more ambitious. You don't know it yet, but the seed of the Tale of Genji has been planted. And here's the twist, she doesn't write it all at once. This isn't some NaNoWriMo mad dash. She composes Genji in episodes, sometimes sharing them with other court women, sometimes reciting chapters aloud, letting feedback ripple back to her like pond water touched by a single finger. Think of it like a serialized drama whispered from sleeve to sleeve. New chapters are eagerly awaited. People quote them in love notes. Even men important ones start getting curious. Who is this mysterious woman writing about heartbreak with such precision? You watch her revise in the dark, scratching out lines by lamplight. There's a quiet kind of joy here. Not the joy of attention, but the joy of expression. The joy of saying something no one has dared to say before. Because Murasaki's gift isn't just style. It's depth. She captures interiority. Characters who have inner lives. Conflicts that unfold not just through plot, but through emotion. It's revolutionary. And you wonder if she even knows that. As night falls on the Kyoto rooftops and cicadas begin their chorus, you hear her brush pause. She looks up. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks. Maybe she smiles. Or maybe not. You'll never know. But something has changed. The girl who read too much is becoming the woman who will change storytelling forever. You wake to the sound of drums, soft, steady, ceremonial. You're inside the walls of the Imperial Palace now, but nothing feels imperial the way you imagined. No glittering thrones. No Roman fanfare. Just layers upon layers of silence, protocol, and unspoken competition. Welcome to the Heian court, the most elegant pressure cooker in history. It's not the emperor who runs things here. It's the women behind the curtains, the men behind them, and the 1,000 little choices that keep a household from scandal. You stroll through corridors where courtiers waft by like ghosts, faces half hidden by sleeves, their presence announced by scent rather than speech. Yes, scent Heian nobles often wore custom-blended incense on their robes, like signature perfumes. One guy even created an entire love triangle because 2 women used the same incense blend. Tragic, Murasaki enters this world reluctantly. She's summoned to court after the death of her husband, sometime in her early 30s. Her reputation as a brilliant writer has been spreading like whispered fan fiction. Eventually, it reaches Empress Shoshi, the teenage consort of Emperor Ichijo. Shoshi's father, Fujiwara no Michinaga, a political puppet master with excellent taste and literary talent, decides Murasaki should become a lady-in-waiting and tutor to the Empress. Basically, here, teach my daughter how to impress people with poetry. So she goes. Probably not thrilled about it, but in Heian, Japan, refusing a powerful man's polite suggestion is about as easy as trying to untangle wet silk. You watch her arrive at court, eyes narrowed, lips politely pressed together. Around her swirl rival women, other ladies-in-waiting, each chosen for some combination of pedigree, penmanship, and passive-aggressive charm. These aren't friends. They're poetic gladiators. They wield sarcasm like lace-draped daggers. And Murasaki, she's quieter. Observing, judging. She finds them frivolous. Her diary doesn't hide it. She writes about how these women spend all their time gossiping and competing for attention. She, on the other hand, prefers solitude in writing, which of course also gets judged. One courtier calls her standoffish. Another complains that she's too proud. Historians still argue whether Murasaki was truly aloof or just sick of everyone else's haiku. She slips into her role anyway. She teaches Shoshi to read Chinese an act that's both intellectually daring and socially risky. Women weren't supposed to flaunt their command of Chinese classics. Too masculine, too serious, too uppity. But Shoshi learns anyway, under Murasaki's careful guidance. And somewhere in this arrangement, Murasaki finds her footing. She's not dazzling the court with beauty or charm. She's dazzling them with words. She's a misfit, but a powerful one. And maybe that's what makes this so interesting. You're in a space where appearance is everything, but Murasaki's weapon is invisibility. She blends into the background, listens to everything, and absorbs the court's absurdity like rain through rice paper. From behind her screen, she hears it all. The flirtations, the petty arguments, the overly dramatic poetry contests. She jots it down not as a diarist, but as a collector. It all becomes fuel. One particular episode stands out. A woman sends Murasaki a sarcastic poem mocking her supposed arrogance. Murasaki responds with a verse so precise and cold it might as well have been dipped in snow. You don't just hear it, you feel the drop in room temperature. Here's your historical nugget. The Heian court invented its own form of soft warfare. No swords, no battles, just poetry, gifts, and social slights, so refined they could strip paint off walls. A wrong word in a love letter could destroy your standing. Murasaki knew how to play that game and win. But she also begins to tire of it. Her diary, known as the Murasaki Shikibu Nikki, drips with quiet frustration. She writes about the emptiness of court life, the vanity, the shallowness. She feels trapped in a place where intelligence is admired only when it's ornamental. And yet it's exactly this environment that gives birth to the Tale of Genji. Because here, behind curtains and incense clouds, Murasaki sees the patterns. She watches noblemen seduce, abandon, and return. She sees women cling to ideals, to rituals, to illusions. She sees how people perform love, ambition, and grief. Not because they're shallow, but because they're trained to. And she starts to write about it. Not in her diary, not in poems, but in story, fiction. She creates a fictional world that reflects the real one, but skewed, softened, and soaked in longing. A world with a prince so beautiful and tragic that you want to reach through the page and slap him. A world where feelings are described not just as actions, but as seasons, dreams, and colors. A world where the worst thing you can do isn't break a rule. It's break someone's heart without really meaning to. At night, when the court sleeps under lacquered beams and folded silks, she scribbles on scrolls. Alone, focused. The lamp sputters, the ink runs dry, the sleeves of her robe soak up candle smoke. But she keeps going. And somewhere out there, Shoshi is reading the chapters. Then others. Soon even men outside the palace are clamoring for the next scroll. It's word-of-mouth publishing at its finest. Pre-modern book club chaos. You hover near the paper screens, watching it all. The tutor no one noticed has become the author no one can ignore. But she's still hidden. Still masked. People debate who she is. Some don't even know it's a woman writing. Others whisper behind fans, guessing. Still, Murasaki never claims credit. She just keeps writing. Because that's the real rebellion here, not in becoming famous, but in writing deeply, honestly and fearlessly in a world that values appearance over truth. And as summer drapes its humid shawl across the capital, you sense the tide shifting. Court life still sparkles on the surface. But underneath, something else is rising. A story, a voice, a truth wrapped in fiction. And it's only just beginning. You hear the soft crackle of an oil lamp, the hush of cloth on polished wood, and the tiny, deliberate scrape of a brush against paper. You're in her writing chamber now, barely more than a partitioned corner of the palace. Murasaki sits still, shoulders slightly hunched, the hem of her robe curled neatly beneath her knees. She dips her brush in ink, pauses, and exhales before she writes the next line. This is where the real magic happens. Not in court salons or poetry contests, but here, where a woman works quietly in the dark, shaping what will become one of the greatest literary achievements in history. And right now, she probably has no idea. You watch her lay out fresh scrolls. Her sleeves are tucked just enough to keep them from smudging her work. Her inkstone sits beside her like an old friend, worn smooth by repetition. She has no keyboard clicks, no blue light. Just shadows, paper, and time. She's writing the Tale of Genji. Not in one frenzied burst, but gradually, carefully. This isn't stream of consciousness, it's a slow alchemy. She writes a scene, then lives with it. Then she rewrites. Often she tests sections aloud. Maybe with trusted women at court. Maybe to herself, murmuring under her breath like a bedtime lullaby you can't quite forget. What she's doing is unheard of. Sure, fiction exists in Heian Japan. There are earlier works like Utsubo Monogatari and fanciful Buddhist tales passed around in temples. But what Murasaki's doing is something different. This is psychological fiction. There's development, continuity, emotional logic. A story not built around events but around consequences. And who is Genji, this beautiful doomed prince? He's the son of an emperor and a low-ranking consort, too low-born to inherit the throne, but too dazzling to ignore. From his first appearance, he oozes elegance and melancholy. His relationships are intricate, often inappropriate, always complicated. He falls in love too easily and often with women who resemble his dead mother. Yikes. Historians still argue whether Genji is an idealized fantasy or a quiet satire of Heian masculinity. Either way, you can't look away. He's not a hero. He's a beautifully dressed warning. Murasaki doesn't write with moral certainty. She writes with empathy and ambiguity. You don't know who's right or wrong. You just know who's hurting. In one scene, Genji leaves a woman weeping behind a screen. In another, he regrets everything but not enough to stop. It's like watching a man fall in love with a mirror and then blame it for cracking. Meanwhile, Murasaki is working within severe limitations. She can't describe things like war or law or commerce. Those weren't considered feminine subjects. So she goes inward? She maps the terrain of longing, disappointment, and impermanence. One character spends a whole chapter just regretting a letter he didn't send. Another agonizes over whether a glance lasted too long. You'd think this would be boring. And yet you're hooked. And it's not just the story, it's the style. Murasaki's prose flows like silk, with long, winding sentences that drift from thought to thought like incense smoke. Emotions are rarely stated outright. Instead, you feel them gathering, like rain about to fall. Even modern Japanese readers study her language like scholars decoding ancient music. It's classical Japanese dense, elegant, subtle. Reading Genji is like hearing a dream translated by moonlight. Quirky tidbit. Heian readers used to read aloud in pairs. One person would hold the scroll and read, while the other interpreted or discussed. So the Tale of Genji was probably experienced, communally like a binge-worthy drama series, only with more sighing and silk robes. And yes, the chapters had cliffhangers. Sometimes Genji falls sick. Sometimes a forbidden romance teeters on the edge of exposure. Sometimes someone dies after dreaming of a ghost, and people at court needed to know what happened next. They pestered Murasaki for new installments. Some sent her poems asking when the next scroll would appear. One noble even wrote his own fanfic. It's hard not to giggle at that. 1,000 years ago, this was already happening. Unfinished chapters, dramatic shipping debates, readers getting far too invested. You almost expect to find a clay tablet etched with, "I can fix him." But back in her room, Murasaki keeps writing. Her scrolls pile up like ripples in a pond. Genji matures. Women enter and exit his life like seasonal blossoms. Time moves differently in this world. Fluid, aching, unhurried. One of the most heartbreaking parts? Characters age. Genji grows older, and so do the women he once loved. Some die, some become nuns. Some vanish into memory. And it hurts because you've lived with them so long, you feel their passing in your chest. Murasaki is crafting something revolutionary. A story that treats fictional lives with the same weight as real ones. She understands that people don't just want happy endings, they want resonance. They want the ache of recognition. The feeling that someone, somewhere, understands what it's like to long for something lost. She's giving them that. Quietly, reluctantly. Brilliantly. Still, she doesn't stop being Murasaki. In her diary, she writes that she finds court life tiresome. She doesn't like small talk. She's irritated by women who only care about status. She worries that she's too proud, or too clever, or too obviously clever. It's exhausting being exceptional in a world that demands modesty. Yet, even in those diary entries, you see her discipline. She notes the date, the weather, the mood. She uses metaphor, always. Even her complaints are elegant. She's like someone who folds her laundry angrily but still lines everything up by color. And through it all, she writes. She writes while courtiers flirt. She writes while Shoshi gives birth to imperial sons. She writes as emperors come and go. The world moves on in brocade and blossoms, and Murasaki keeps quietly laying down the foundation of modern narrative fiction. You lean against the screen and you wonder if she ever realized what she was doing. If she ever paused mid-sentence and thought, I'm changing literature forever. Probably not. She was too busy making sure her ink didn't smear. You're in the heart of the palace now, threading your way through the cool silence of twilight halls. The flickering lanterns cast strange shadows on the painted panels. Peacocks, bamboo, and court ladies more poised than real life ever allows. You can hear a distant hum of ritual chanting, muffled behind thick doors. And somewhere inside this intricate maze of elegance and unspoken rivalry, Murasaki is being asked to do the one thing she never asked for. Belong. Lady Murasaki has officially entered the imperial bubble. Not just as a guest, not just as a quiet observer from the sidelines, but as a court lady in service to Empress Shoshi. This is both an honor and a trap. Because the closer you get to power in Heian Japan, the more you're expected to disappear. Visibility reel, expressive, female visibility is not the goal. You exist to be heard through your poems, seen through your handwriting, admired through veils. Murasaki isn't interested in becoming a social star. She's here for other reasons, quiet ones. Empress Shoshi is still very young, and Murasaki becomes her tutor in Chinese classics. It's a bold move considering women weren't supposed to read those texts at all. Chinese writing was considered too masculine, too scholarly, too bristly with Confucian philosophy. But Shoshi learns anyway. Murasaki teaches her in secret, often behind curtains, her voice low and deliberate. You picture them in candlelight, a scroll unrolled between them, the room filled with that soft scratch of brush on paper. In that moment, Murasaki isn't just teaching. She's passing on subversion. The Empress listens, learns. And with each lesson, Murasaki quietly pulls the strings behind the girl on the throne. Yet, despite the intimacy of tutoring, Murasaki is never fully at ease in court. Her diary reveals a deep discomfort with the endless performance of court life. The flatteries, the gift-giving rituals, the daily avalanche of etiquette. She writes about her fellow ladies-in-waiting in a tone that's equal parts bemused and exhausted. One woman, she notes, wears too much makeup. Another tries too hard to impress with poems. Murasaki's judgments are sharp, but not cruel. Just tired, she isn't trying to win anyone over. She's trying to survive with her integrity intact. Still, survival at court demands finesse. You can't just sulk behind a curtain forever. Murasaki participates in poetry contests, even helps Shoshi respond to verses from high-ranking men. Her words, always cloaked in metaphor, begin to reach ears that matter. One of those ears belongs to Fujiwara no Michinaga, the Empress's father. Now, Michinaga is a force. He's the de facto ruler of Japan at this point, operating through careful marriage arrangements and well-placed daughters. He's also inconveniently very much intrigued by Murasaki. Historians still argue whether Michinaga and Murasaki had an affair. Her diary includes some cryptic references. A visit here, a borrowed fan there, a poem left in her room at night. All within the realm of plausible deniability. But the undercurrent is there. One night, Michinaga supposedly enters her quarters uninvited. Murasaki doesn't say what happens. She just records that he came, and left, and that she wept afterward. Whether it was love, coercion, or simply survival, you'll never know. But you feel her frustration, tangled into the folds of that memory. Still, she remains at court. Not because she loves it, but because it gives her access. The palace is a stage, and everyone's performing. Murasaki watches it all from the wings, scribbling down every nuance, every false smile. She's quietly gathering material for Genji, even if she doesn't know it yet. Here's your quirky court detail for the night. Noble women often communicated with men through layers of fabric. Literally. They sat behind screens, curtains, even heavy veils. A man might only see a woman's sleeve or hear her voice. Judgments were made based on fabric color coordination, scent, and how eloquently she responded to poetry. It's like speed dating, but with more incense and zero eye contact. In that world, Murasaki is a sensation. Not because she flirts or flutters, but because she writes better than anyone else. Her wit is razor sharp. Her poems land like snowflakes that cut. People send her verses just to see how she'll reply. She is in many ways the voice of the Empress's salon. Not officially, not publicly, but her writing becomes the backbone of Shoshi's cultural prestige, which matters more than it sounds. In Heian, Japan, being the emperor's consort isn't just about lineage. It's about who can draw the brightest minds, host the best poetry nights, and send the most devastating seasonal poems. Empresses compete through their ladies. And Murasaki helps Shoshi win. Shoshi gives birth to 2 sons, securing her position even further. The palace celebrates, and Murasaki remains at her side, now more deeply woven into the court fabric than ever. But the deeper in she gets, the more isolated she feels. Her diary becomes a lifeline, a place to be honest, if only with herself. She writes about missing her daughter, about court women who exhaust her, about the ache of being needed but never quite known. You begin to sense that Genji isn't just a masterpiece. It's a mirror. A world Murasaki creates because the one she lives in refuses to see her clearly. She fills it with the things she can't say aloud, the sorrow of women pushed aside, the masks men wear, the quiet ruin of beauty over time. She doesn't offer solutions. She offers understanding. And as her scrolls pass from chamber to chamber, noble women whisper about the story. They see themselves in the pages, in the silent lovers, in the forgotten wives, In The Women Who Wait for Letters That Never Come, Murasaki becomes more than a court lady. She becomes a voice for all of them, especially the ones no one listens to. And somewhere, late at night, as the drums signal the changing of the palace watch, you see her pick up her brush again. The ink glistens. The candle flickers. The story continues. You step softly now, through halls that barely breathe. The deep, behind every painted screen, behind every embroidered curtain, is a life unfolding in silence. And it's in this quiet, veiled world where Murasaki listens, where she waits, where she watches. Life behind the screens isn't dramatic in the conventional sense. There are no battles, no declarations, no duels at dawn. Instead, there are glances that last a second too long. There are poems slipped into sleeves. There are late-night confessions murmured half awake, and regrets that cling like smoke to silk. And Murasaki records all of it. She lives among women who have no power and yet hold all the secrets. They don't make decisions, but they influence them. They don't speak in court, but they compose verses that sway imperial hearts. Murasaki sees how performance becomes survival, and how survival slowly eats at the soul. She learns that to thrive in court, you must master the art of emotional misdirection. If you're angry, write a poem about autumn leaves. If you're heartbroken, mention a drifting cloud. If you're furious enough to set the room on fire, burn incense instead. These rules aren't written, but they're absolute. And so she studies them, quietly, patiently. Like a scientist observing wild birds, except the birds are noble women with passive-aggressive haiku and deeply repressed romantic trauma. You see her navigate the rhythms of daily palace life. Waking at dawn to comb her hair, floor-length thick, always perfectly kept. Dressing in 12 layers of robes carefully chosen for color harmony. Watching from the shadows as the Empress receives visitors, or composes yet another congratulatory note for someone's poetic third cousin. And all the while, Murasaki is absorbing detail. It's not the events that interest her. It's the undercurrent. The way a nobleman tilts his head when lying. The way a woman's sleeves tremble when she receives a poem from someone she thought had forgotten her. The moment when laughter rises a little too quickly. An apology buried inside a joke. She stores these things. Later, when she writes another chapter of Genji, you see the moments replayed, transformed. A jealous glance becomes a subplot. A half-forgotten poem resurfaces as emotional closure. A quiet death from melancholy. What we'd now call depression becomes one of the most painfully human scenes in the tale. One of the most revolutionary things Murasaki does is treat women's experiences as central, not peripheral. In a time when female pain was often brushed aside or euphemized, she dives straight into it. The women in Genji don't just love and wait. They suffer, yearn, manipulate, grieve, and age. Their inner worlds matter. And even though she's writing fiction, she's also documenting something real. Because life behind the screens is emotional labor. It's constant calculation. When to speak, how to reply, which poem to choose. One misplaced metaphor can ruin your entire standing. Here's a strange little tidbit. In Heian court life, even the color of your underrobes could spark gossip. There were strict seasonal pairings: plum over moss green in early spring, russet with pale gray in autumn. Get it wrong? Expect poetry-based mockery by lunch? And yet, in this micromanaged environment, Murasaki finds freedom in observation. She's one of the few women who turns all this subtlety into material. Not just for entertainment, but for art. Still, the weight of it wears on her. In her diary, she writes about longing for simplicity, for stillness, for a life without all the coded expectations. She even mocks herself for pretending to enjoy social gatherings. You get the feeling that she's playing a role she didn't audition for. But she plays it well enough to remain. Maybe that's the trick. Don't be the brightest star, just the quiet one no one can afford to lose. And in those gaps between obligations after the last ritual of the evening, when the palace grows still, Murasaki writes. You lean over her shoulder as she drafts another Genji chapter. The page is smooth, the brush deliberate. Her style is unhurried but never lazy. It winds through thoughts like a stream under willow branches. A character recalls a childhood scene. Another stares at the moon and weeps. A minor gesture a hand, brushing against a screen, says more than pages of dialogue ever could. She's writing not just about love, but about ephemerality. The Buddhist idea that everything is fleeting: youth, beauty, affection, even reputation, even revenge. And all of that she's learning firsthand at court. People fall in and out of favor in a single poem. A rumor can erase you. An emperor's affection shifts like the seasons. Murasaki knows that the palace isn't a place of permanence. It's a paper garden built on dreams. And sometimes dreams mold in the rain. Historians still debate how much of Genji is autobiography. Did she model characters on real people? Is Genji a satire of Michinaga? Is the Lady Rokujo jealous and spiritual based on a rival at court? No one can say for sure. But you suspect that everything she saw behind the screens found its way into fiction eventually. And that's the secret. Fiction gave her freedom. It allowed her to say what her diary couldn't. To criticize, to mourn, to reveal. All under the veil of storytelling. So when you see her there, curled beside her lamp, brush poised above fresh paper, know that you're watching not just a writer, but a witness. A woman capturing the inner lives no one else dared to name. She closes her eyes for a moment. Maybe to remember something. Or maybe to forget. Then she writes again. The brush moves. The story grows. And the world behind the screen becomes more vivid than the one outside it. A candle sputters in the dark, the tip of its flame bending with the breath of the late-night silence. You're here again, watching her. Murasaki sits on the floor, surrounded by scrolls. Not in a grand hall or scholarly library, but in a quiet, borrowed corner of the palace where no one bothers her after midnight. Her robes are draped like waves around her, inkstone at her side, and her fingers faintly smudged. She leans forward and writes, "This is the moment. The birth of Genji. Not with fanfare, not with a ceremonial unveiling, but with a quiet exhale. You see her write the opening lines. Phrases so gentle, so wistful, that you barely notice their weight at first. But they settle over you like silk. In a certain reign there was a lady not of the first rank. So begins the tale of Hikaru Genji, the Shining Prince. Not the heir to the throne, not the son of an empress, but someone caught in the palace machinery like so many women Murasaki knew. His mother, a favorite consort, dies early. His beauty and poised charm, everyone. But he is, in essence, a man out of place, too low to be emperor, too perfect to be forgotten. And that's the trick, isn't it? Genji's flaw is his perfection. He glides through the court, brilliant in every way poetry, dance, taste, elegance, but utterly ill-equipped for emotional responsibility. He doesn't destroy people maliciously. He simply doesn't see what he leaves behind. It's a masterpiece of irony wrapped in brocade and scented ink. You can feel Murasaki's touch in every line. This isn't fantasy. This isn't escapism. It's realism cloaked in metaphor. And it's breathtaking. Genji's world is stunning lavender gardens, moonlit pavilions, secret rendezvous behind sliding screens. But always, always there's a sadness curling around the edges. Love never lasts. Beauty fades, status crumbles. Murasaki is building a glittering house made entirely of mist. And it is enormous. The Tale of Genji will eventually reach 54 chapters. Hundreds of characters, dozens of relationships, and emotional arcs that stretch across lifetimes. No battle scenes, no quests. Just the raw material of court life. Love, jealousy, poetry, childbirth, illness, regret. And it all begins here in this dim corner of the palace as Murasaki turns emotion into literature. She doesn't write it all at once. The chapters come in bursts over months, maybe years. Some historians believe the early scrolls were shared among the ladies-in-waiting first, passed like gossip, read aloud in small salons. You imagine them giggling, weeping, arguing over Genji's latest misstep. And here's a fascinating little historical detail. Genji didn't have a manuscript. It was copied by hand, by scribes or fans. Different households had different scrolls. No two were quite the same. You could be reading chapter 11 while someone else had only made it to chapter 9. No centralized publisher. Just a slow literary wildfire. At one point, even Emperor Ichijo asked to read it. That's no small thing. This is an era when emperors rarely concerned themselves with women's writing. Certainly not tales. But Genji is different. Its emotional depth, its elegant prose, its shocking honesty, it turns heads, even crowned ones. So what makes Genji feel so real? It's the characters. These aren't just archetypes or courtly ideals. They are flawed, breathing humans. Women who suffer in silence. Men who regret too late. Friends who drift apart. Children who grow up confused by their parents' past. Take, for instance, Genji's affair with a young girl named Murasaki Yes. Same name as the author, possibly as a wink or a mirror. Genji raises her from childhood to be his ideal woman. Historians still argue whether this relationship is meant to be romantic, paternal, disturbing, or all three. But Murasaki doesn't give you easy answers. She simply shows you what happened and leaves you to sit with the discomfort. That's what makes the story so quietly radical. Murasaki doesn't preach. She doesn't point fingers. She simply unveils the emotional mess beneath the poetry. And you, dear listener, are left blinking in its gentle, devastating glow. There's one scene where Genji gazes at an aging lover, remembering how radiant she once was. But he says nothing. She, in turn, pretends not to notice his growing distance. They sit under the same moonlight, both feeling the ache of time, and neither speaking it aloud. It's brutal, it's beautiful, and it's exactly what Murasaki wanted you to see. Still, she doesn't make Genji a villain. That would be too easy. Instead, he's a product of his world raised to perform, adored without consequence, taught to chase beauty but never taught to cherish it. And in that, you see the satire, a gentle whispering critique of Heian masculinity, but also maybe a warning. That idealization leads to disillusionment, that no one, not even a fictional prince, can live up to the poems written about them. Murasaki weaves all of this into the scrolls, and you can't help but think, she's doing something no one has ever done before. Not in this way, not with this depth. Is she inventing the novel? Technically, that's debatable. There were other long-form tales before her, but none quite like Genji. None with this psychological interiority. None that follow a character from youth to death and beyond. It's not just a story, it's a lifetime. And she's writing it from a room no larger than a closet. With no desk, no fountain pen. Just a lamp, an ink brush, and a head full of grief, memory, and absolute genius. Quirky side note? Murasaki might have been the first serialized author to experience creative burnout. Her diary mentions being too tired to continue. She worries that she's losing her skill, that the spark is fading. Ah yes, the timeless lament. I think I peaked 5 chapters ago. Still, she keeps going. Because even when you're weary, when the court is stifling, and the plot feels too tangled, there's something addictive about watching your characters breathe. You glance back at her now. She's paused, brush hovering, eyes distant. Perhaps she's thinking of Genji, of his next misstep, of the woman who will see through him. Or maybe she's thinking of herself, wondering if anyone will ever write her story. You already know the answer. The palace is asleep again, and so are most of its secrets, but not all of them. Not the one on that gently unrolling scroll, where a prince named Genji slips through a painted world, kissing hearts and ruining lives with such grace that you almost forgive him. Almost. Tonight you sit with Murasaki as she rereads what she's written. She tilts her head, considering. A line doesn't ring true. A sigh too theatrical. A glance not heavy enough. She scratches it out, rewrites it softer, sadder. Better. The story has taken root now. It moves forward with its own gravity. But something has shifted. This isn't just the tale of a glittering prince anymore. It's becoming a mirror one that reflects the whole of Heian society back at itself, cloaked in the dreamy fog of fiction. You follow Genji through affair after affair, some noble, some unwise, all steeped in melancholy. He pursues a woman who looks like his dead mother, another who is too young, one who's married to him, technically. And in each encounter, the same question hangs in the air. Does he love them, or just the idea of them? Murasaki doesn't answer. She lets the silence speak. You see how every relationship in Genji is more than romance. It's strategy, escape, longing, illusion. People fall in love because they're lonely, or bored, or trying to fix the wound someone else left. Love is rarely clean here. Often it's a ritual of mismatched expectations. A dance where one partner is always a step behind. There's a chapter where a woman sleeps with Genji, then burns his letter the next morning without reading it. Another where he leaves a sick lover in the mountains, promising to return, but he never does. And another where he seduces a woman too broken to say no, then weeps about how fragile she seemed. Is this love, lust, power? Historians still argue whether Genji is meant to be admired or pitied, or most likely both. Murasaki builds layers into every character, even the so-called minor ones. The jealous wife who leaves the palace to become a nun, the gentle concubine who raises another woman's child, the maidservant who quietly edits love letters for her mistress. They're all given space. Pain, presence. You feel their loneliness ripple through the chapters like wind through bamboo. Always there, just out of sight. And the women in Genji? They're not a monolith. Some are clever and cruel. Some submissive and quiet. Others sharp-tongued, witty, guarded. Some love too much. Some not at all. And none of them are rewarded for honesty. That's the bitter truth Murasaki slides into the story like a hidden blade. Vulnerability doesn't save you. It makes you a footnote in someone else's poem. Even Genji handsome, poetic, royal Genji finds that out eventually. His charm fades. His luster dulls. His choices catch up with him. There's no dramatic fall, just a slow erosion. One day he looks in the mirror and realizes youth has slipped away like incense smoke, yes? And he starts to dream of ghosts. Because yes, there are ghosts in Genji, but not in the way you think. They're not horror movie specters. They're memory ghosts. Emotional hauntings. A woman dies and her spirit lingers not to punish, but to cling. To the man who left. To the life she never finished. One of the most chilling scenes in the tale? The Lady Rokujo, a proud, elegant woman, becomes so consumed by jealousy that her spirit is said to float free from her body and attack her rival. Her victim dies. Rakuyo is horrified. She retreats into a monastery. Was it real, a dream? A metaphor for emotional damage so intense it spills into the physical world? You decide. Because that's what Murasaki does. She hands you questions wrapped in poetry and lets you live with them. A fun sidebar? There's a court rumor that some women started scripting their letters to sound like Genji. They copied Murasaki's style to flirt more poetically or to pretend they were more educated than they were. The way some people quote Shakespeare or text in lowercase for aesthetic reasons? Same vibe, but Heian style. Her language became a trend. Her metaphors, currency. Her scenes, models for how to feel. You wonder if she knew? If, tucked behind her curtain, she ever heard echoes of her own words in someone else's voice. But Murasaki never breaks her mask. In her diary, she barely mentions the story that's taking over the capital. She worries about her daughter's future. She complains about the behavior of other court women. She notes which nobleman wore the wrong robe for the season. And then she writes another chapter that will emotionally wreck people for centuries. That's how Genji grows not in fire, but in slow, steady breath. It doesn't dazzle with plot twists. It devastates with familiarity. The ache of misunderstanding. The pain of almost the beauty of a night too perfect to last. You see her pace slow. Her brush lingers longer between lines. Her characters are aging. She is too. The later chapters shift. Genji withdraws from court life. He builds a quiet palace outside the city, fills it with women, tries to recreate the world he once ruled. But it's all dust. Echo. He becomes less of a hero and more of a ghost in his own story. And then he dies. Quietly, off-screen. No fanfare. One chapter ends. The next begins without him. It's such an audacious narrative move, you nearly drop your imaginary tea. But Murasaki isn't done. The story continues without Genji. His descendants, his mistakes, his legacy. You're not reading about a man anymore. You're reading about what's left after him. About the lives he touched and never really knew. It's stunning, bold, and again, so modern it makes your head tilt. Because the tale of Genji doesn't resolve. It doesn't end with a marriage or a death neatly tied in bow. It just drifts, like real life. You lean back, eyes half-lidded, and listen to the brush move. Murasaki is still writing. But now, her characters feel more like memories than fiction. The story is becoming haunted by loss, by love, by time. And so is she. There's a rustle in the hallway. Slippers, whispered laughter. A breeze stirs the outer screens. You sit still and let the hush settle again. Because something curious is happening now. Something Murasaki never planned. Her story is escaping. It begins innocently. A court lady asks to borrow a scroll. Then a minor noble wants to hear the next installment. Soon copies are being made by hand painstakingly, reverently, with careful brushstrokes, and not a single Xerox in sight. The tale of Genji is spreading like spilled perfume, invisible, irresistible, and impossible to retrieve once loosed into the air. You watch as scrolls are carried from one noblewoman's quarters to another's. Some are incomplete. One reader might only have chapters 1 to 14, another might have 8 through 20, but nothing in between. And everyone wants more. It's literary FOMO high-end edition. There's no central publisher. No editorial board. Just word of mouth and ink-stained fingers. It's chaotic, it's glorious. And it's turning Murasaki into a quiet sensation. Women read it aloud to each other in salons, behind curtains. their voices dropping on the sad parts, giggling on the romantic ones. You can almost hear them. Did you read the bit where Genji sends 3 poems in one morning? Yes, but Lady AY's ghost scene. I couldn't sleep! Men are reading it too. Some in secret, some not. They act as though it's a guilty pleasure. But you see the way they lean in when new scrolls arrive. How they quote Genji in their own letters without giving credit, of course. Historians believe even Emperor Ichijo read the tale, which would be the literary equivalent of the president binge-watching a viral indie series and then recommending it to the cabinet. But what's most surprising isn't just the attention, it's the reaction. People begin to see themselves in the story. They argue about characters. They send each other poems in response to fictional situations. They start dressing like Genji. They name pets after Genji. One noble even builds a private pavilion modeled after a scene from the book. Because if you're going to imitate fiction, go full fanboy. And here's a fun oddity. Some readers don't just read Genji, they rewrite it. They add missing scenes, alternative endings, personal interpolations. It's the year 1005-ish, and fanfiction is alive and well. Murasaki never intended this. She began Genji as a quiet exercise, a meditation, a way to give shape to all the emotion and observation that had nowhere else to go. But now it's alive, carried from hand to hand, one elegant ink stroke at a time. You walk through the palace and hear lines from Genji whispered like secrets. Girls use quotes to flirt. Poets respond to Genji's fictional verses as though he were real. The story becomes a kind of emotional language. One people share when they can't speak plainly. And that's the beauty of it. Genji says the things no one dares to say in court. That men are careless. That women are lonely. That beauty fades and longing lasts. That heartbreak doesn't end. It just changes costumes. But with popularity comes pressure. Murasaki is no longer writing in a vacuum. She's being watched. Expected, quizzed. Imagine trying to compose your next chapter when the future empress casually asks what Genji's going to do next. No pressure, right? She never had a publication plan. No outline, just the rhythm of her own emotions and the brush to translate them. And now she's being treated like a prophet of sorrow and elegance. Or worse, a source of endless entertainment. You sense her mood shifting? Her diary entries grow more reserved. She writes less. When she does, it's with a weariness just beneath the surface. She worries about being too proud, about how people interpret her, about whether her writing is being used, not understood. And still, she writes, because the story isn't done. Because these characters need to live their sad little lives all the way through. Because she knows something no one else does, that the ending isn't really the point. In one of the later chapters, a minor character reads Genji's poetry and weeps not because it's beautiful, but because it feels true. That moment echoes across time. Because that's what Murasaki gives people, emotional recognition. The relief of being seen in ink. Even when her scrolls are copied and recopied and miscopied, even when readers skip whole sections or misinterpret them, or turn them into gossip, Genji endures. And unlike most high-end works, it's not just a court novelty. It's a universe. One where you can enter any time. Where the rules are strict, the robes are heavy, the love is doomed, and yet, you want to stay. You want to sit with these people as they ruin each other with gentle smiles and tactful silence. Because they're you. Or at least they know how you felt, even if they're centuries removed. There's a reason some scholars call Genji the world's first psychological novel. It's not the first story, but it might be the first time someone said, what if we told a tale where feelings are the action? And now it's spreading beyond the court, out to the provinces, passed between ladies and dusty outposts, read by monks who claim to be scandalized but can't stop at chapter 3. Even the samurai later will puzzle over the tale's refined sadness, trying to find honor in Genji's sighs. You think back to the beginning, to that girl in Kyoto whose father said it was a pity she wasn't a boy, who learned Chinese in secret, who watched from behind curtains and turned her silence into a masterpiece. And now that masterpiece is slipping through the capital like mist through pine trees. You can't hold it, but you feel it. And so does everyone else. Murasaki doesn't gloat. She doesn't parade. She keeps writing. Slowly, carefully. Because stories like this aren't written. They're lived and then captured like breath on cold glass. And she's the only one who knows how. The palace garden shimmers in the moonlight. The gravel paths raked into swirls as precise as brushstrokes. You step carefully now because around you something is shifting. The tale of Genji is no longer just a whisper behind court screens. It's a thundercloud of silk and syllables. And not everyone's pleased. As Murasaki's work ripples outward, it begins to collect a strange entourage. Rivals, critics, imitators, and sycophants. All very proper, of course. No one throws tomatoes. This is Heian, Japan. You throw poems, and you're in the middle of a literary battlefield. Now, only the weapons are 31 syllables long, delivered on dyed paper and sprinkled with powdered incense. The first wave of tension? Rival writers. Particularly Sei Shonagun, a courtier and author of The Pillow Bookasharp, stylish collection of lists, anecdotes, and snark. Murasaki and Sei never directly insulted each other in writing, but Murasaki's diary contains some heavily shaded commentary about a woman who rattles off clever phrases but lacks depth. You don't need to squint too hard to see the target. Historians still argue whether their rivalry was exaggerated later or genuinely icy. What we do know is that they served different empresses, wrote in very different voices, and probably circled each other like elegant cats in opposing sunbeams. Then there were the readers. Oh, the readers. Some adored Genji so much they began to quote it in letters, even pretending that certain characters were real historical figures. One woman asked a monk whether Genji's ghost still haunted the imperial grounds. Another tried to trace her family lineage back to one of his fictional descendants. You admire the commitment. Others weren't so charitable. Some male scholars dismissed the tale as a women's diversion, too steeped in romance and sentiment to be of intellectual merit. Never mind that it was more psychologically complex than most Chinese treatises they could quote. Nope, feelings equals frilly, and frilly equals unworthy. Murasaki, of course, never directly defends herself. She doesn't write rebuttals. She just keeps quietly turning out chapters that are more profound than most of her critics' entire careers. Because that's how you win a literary duel in Heian, Japan. You don't duel. You just outlast them. And yet something strange begins to happen. Readers, unable to believe a woman could write so compellingly, start attributing her work to men. Some say a male courtier must have edited the chapters. Others insist the more philosophical scenes were ghost-written by monks. The logic? Well, no woman could understand emotion in Buddhism. Cool. You shake your head, deeply unimpressed. But Murasaki doesn't rise to this bait either. She lets the work speak. And it speaks loudly. Even centuries later, scholars still study Genji not just for its literary merit, but for the philosophical questions it raises. Reincarnation, the illusion of permanence, the loneliness of power, the futility of desire, and woven through it all, the story of people trying and failing to truly know one another. Which brings us to the imitators. You can't walk 5 steps in the palace now without bumping into someone composing a sequel or spin-off. A few ladies start crafting side stories, some about Genji's supposed childhood, others imagining his adventures in the afterlife. One scroll appears claiming to be the lost chapter that Murasaki forgot to include. Spoiler, she didn't. Most of these works don't survive. But their very existence proves the point. Genji is no longer just a tale. It's a shared cultural language. Even children of noble families are said to grow up hearing Genji stories as lullabies, which, considering the amount of emotional devastation per chapter, makes you question the parenting standards of the time. But hey, trauma builds character, right? Still, the popularity has consequences. Murasaki begins to feel the strain. Her diary grows more introspective, more guarded. She writes about feeling disconnected from other women at court, about being misunderstood, about growing weary of the very world that celebrates her work. You sit beside her one evening as she folds a scroll, not to write, just to hold it. Her fingers run along the edge, eyes distant. You wonder if she's thinking of Genji, of how he started as a fictional shadow and became a living myth, and whether he's now bigger than her. Because that's the danger of success. The creation escapes the creator. People mold it to their needs. They love it. They worship it. They misread it entirely. You glance around the court now and see it. A woman quotes Genji to impress a prince. A man sends a Genji-inspired poem to 3 lovers on the same morning. A scholar rewrites a scene to make Genji more morally righteous. Murasaki watches it all, smiles politely, says nothing. But you can feel her pulling away. The scrolls still come, but slower now. The lines grow leaner. More shadow than light. Genji's later years in the tale are quieter, lonelier, fragmented. It's almost as if Murasaki is writing herself into the margins one line at a time. And yet she continues. Because writing, for her, is not performance. It's not even ambition. It's witnessing. Taking the quiet things people hide behind ceremony and laying them bare softly, beautifully, without apology. Even as others try to steal her style, dilute her message, or reshape her characters, she holds the line. She never stoops to argue. She just writes. That's the real defiance. And maybe deep down she knows what you know. That no imitation, no gossip, no court flattery can touch the heart of what she's done. She didn't just give the world a story. She gave it a vocabulary for the soul. And long after her scrolls fade, that will remain. The room is darker now. The candle is burned low, casting a narrow glow that trembles against the wall. You watch Murasaki pause over the page, not stuck, exactly, but stilled. She isn't writing Genji tonight. She's thinking. And the thoughts are heavier than before. The story has traveled far, but tonight is not about the scrolls or the readers. Tonight, you sit with the woman, not the writer. And the woman is tired. Murasaki's fame, if you can call it that, has reached an uneasy peak. Her tale is beloved, yes. Shared, quoted, copied, but so is her loneliness. Behind the careful diary entries, behind the polished responses and elegant court conduct, there is something aching. Grief, real grief. You first see it in how she writes about her daughter. Daini no Sanmi, already clever, already composing poems, has begun her own ascent in court society. But the bond between them, once constant, is now intermittent. They live apart, separated by service and rank and expectations. Murasaki worries. Not aloud, but in half-finished diary lines. Her daughter is growing up in the same labyrinth of veils and expectations. And Murasaki knows exactly where that leads. Her mother's long gone, her husband dead. Friends? Few. Most are court women whose loyalty is transactional, laced with layers of etiquette so stiff it feels like armor. Even those who admire her can't fully see her. And the man, Fujiwara no Michinaga, the most powerful man in the realm, father to Empress Shoshi, still flits in and out of her diary like an unsolvable riddle. Their relationship remains cloaked in ambiguity. Sometimes he visits. Sometimes he leaves verses. Sometimes nothing at all. And in between, silent. What she does say in her diary is telling that she often weeps alone. That the things she feels most deeply must remain unwritten or else, written sideways into fiction. You begin to understand why Genji's world feels the way it does. It's not just invention, it's translation. A rendering of lived sadness into poetic shape. Murasaki doesn't exercise her pain. She refines it. She lets it steep until it's palatable and then serves it in scroll-sized portions. Take the character of Lady Murasaki, yes again, same name. Genji's great love. Raised by him, cherished. Eventually lost. Her arc is one of the most haunting in the tale, filled with soft devastation. She is always close, always insufficient, always slowly fading. Murasaki, the author, gives her namesake no triumph, no redemption, only quiet resignation. It feels personal. There's another chapter 1 most readers miss where an unnamed woman writes a long letter, begging the man she once loved to acknowledge her pain. He doesn't reply. Instead, he sends her a single flower. She smiles, weeps, and burns the letter. That's it. No revenge. No closure, just an echo. You realize that Murasaki's fiction isn't just a story about people who suffer. It's a story about people who endure suffering beautifully. With grace, with restraint. With poetry. Because in her world, that's the only survival. Even Genji's most passionate moments are wrapped in silence. No one says what they mean. They just compose poems about dewdrops and hope the other person understands. But not everyone in her life is fictional. One entry in her diary, nearly hidden in a section about palace duties, mentions a court lady's sudden death. She writes it plainly. No embellishment. But the stillness in the line tells you it mattered. That this person who might have laughed beside her, complained about the food, whispered about new verses was there, and then wasn't. In a place obsessed with beauty and permanence, death is the uninvited guest, always close, always disguised as seasonal illness, as quiet withdrawal, as someone who simply stops being mentioned. And yet no one speaks of grief. Not allowed, so Murasaki folds it into her story. In the later chapters of Genji, death becomes frequent and quieter. One character falls ill and spends his final days writing poetry to friends he hasn't seen in years. Another dreams of her dead lover, unsure if he came to comfort her or haunt her. And Genji himself? He fades into the background. His radiance dims. He becomes a man remembered rather than seen. That, more than anything, mirrors what Murasaki is feeling. The shift, from presence to absence, from voice to echo. And still, she writes, but the pages feel different now. Less sweeping, more fragmented, as if the narrative is being slowly unstitched. Characters grow distant from each other. Lovers don't reply. Children inherit burdens they don't understand. The palace that once glittered with incense and flirtation becomes a maze of ghosts and regrets. You sit with Murasaki as she brushes out another chapter. Her strokes are slower, her expression unreadable. There's a kind of peace in her silence now, but it's not serenity. It's acceptance. She knows the court will move on without her. That new voices will rise, new empresses will summon new ladies to write new verses. She knows Genji may be copied 100 times, altered, even forgotten. But she's written it anyway. And she's written herself into its silence. Here's your fringe fact for the evening. Some later readers believe that parts of Genji held encoded Buddhist teachings, that the later chapters in particular were meant as spiritual preparation for loss. That Genji's emotional arc mirrored a pilgrimage from illusion to awakening. No one knows if Murasaki intended that, but you wouldn't be surprised. Because as she sets down her brush for the night, closes her inkstone, and breathes a slow sigh into the darkness, you understand something vital. She never wanted to be a legend. She just wanted to be heard, even if only in fiction. The scrolls are starting to thin. You notice it as you sit beside her, Murasaki, now older, quieter, writing less frequently. The court around her buzzes, as it always has, but she's no longer watching it with the same hungry eyes. The drama still plays out, of course. New ladies arrive, younger and more polished. New poems are exchanged with fresh flourishes. The seasons still spin like a well-wound wheel. But she has changed. The tale, the one that began with Genji's glittering entrance, is drifting into its final chapters. Only now something eerie happens. Genji disappears, literally. After chapter 41, the seer, the shining prince hero, heartbreaker, poetry god, vanishes from the narrative. He dies, yes, but Murasaki doesn't write the moment. No ceremony, no grand exit. One chapter ends, the next begins, and suddenly it's someone else's story. You're left blinking. Where did he go? This absence has confounded readers for centuries. Historians still argue whether Murasaki simply got bored of her golden boy, or whether she made a deliberate choice to erase him, to let his absence speak louder than his life. You wonder, as you watch her pause over her inkstone, if she saw it coming. If she reached that part of the story and realized he had nothing more to say, because the story continues without him. The last 13 chapters, known as the Uji chapters, shift the lens to his descendants. They move out of Kyoto into the misty river town of Uji, a place steeped in Buddhist melancholy and existential overtones. The main character now is Kaoru, Genji's presumed son, but possibly someone else's. And he is nothing like Genji. Where Genji radiated charm, Kaoru radiates hesitation. He overthinks, he questions. He loves but with guilt. He is, in every way, the next generation's quieter echo of all the mistakes that came before. And then there's Niu, another possible heir Genji's grandson. Beautiful, bold, flirtatious. He's more like Genji, but with even less depth. All flash, no foundation. Between them, a new love triangle emerges. Complicated, slow, painfully self-aware. They pursue two sisters, Ojimi and Nakanokimi, in a spiral of longing, restraint, miscommunication, and inevitable heartbreak. It's darker than anything that came before. Characters suffer more consciously. They know they're repeating past mistakes, and they do it anyway. One woman starves herself to death. Another runs away in the night. Another sends a farewell poem with a pressed flower, knowing full well it will be misunderstood. You watch Murasaki write these chapters with a steady hand, but the sadness in her eyes has deepened. These are not the scrolls passed around the court for fun. These are scrolls whispered about. Respected, but feared too. Because they don't offer escape. They offer reckoning. In one scene, Kaoru visits a temple and hears a woman chanting sutras in the dark. He thinks it's the object of his affection. It isn't. He leaves shaken, feeling something he can't name. That's the emotional terrain now. The things that go unsaid. And still, no one knows why she ended it this way. Some believe Murasaki died before she could finish the story. Others think she left it deliberately incomplete, like a bell cut off mid-ring. One theory even suggests the last chapters are written by someone else. The style shifts, the pacing stutters. Did a fan step in to finish the tale? Did Murasaki leave notes? Or did she just stop? No one knows, and that silence like Genji's becomes part of the story. You feel it now, sitting with her. She's older, her face is thinner, her posture a little more bent, but the mind still precise, still spinning shadows into silk. She doesn't write as often. Some nights she just stares at the ink. Other nights she watches the moon. And some nights she does neither, just folds her hands and listens to the wind over the palace tiles. What happened to her after Genji? The records blur. No one wrote her biography. She disappears from official court documents. At some point her diary ends. There is no farewell poem, no note to future readers. She simply fades like a character from her own fiction. Some believe she retired to a convent. Others think she died in service to Shoshi, still a court lady until her final days. A few even insist she lived long enough to see her daughter rise as a poet in her own right. What's certain is that her voice, so sharp, so human, went quiet, and the silence left behind is deafening. There's something quietly haunting about that. A woman who created an entire literary world, who shaped characters more vivid than her own life ever allowed, simply vanishes from history. Not with drama, not with scandal, but with silence, which feels right. Because Murasaki never needed applause. She didn't write for fame. She wrote through longing, through observation, through the ache of being unseen. She gave her heart to the page, disguised it in fiction, and then let the world take it as it wished. Quirky side note? Centuries later, pilgrims would visit what they believed was her grave, leaving poems and flowers like offerings to a shrine. They'd write their wishes, hoping the woman who wrote so deeply of love and loss might understand. And maybe she would have. Maybe wherever she went, she carried all of this Genji, Kaoru, the sisters, the silences with her. And then, when no one was watching, she simply set down her brush and let it be. No fanfare, no ending. Just the gentle fading out of a life lived in ink. The wind off the river bends the reeds as you walk beside it now, following not a person, but a memory. Murasaki is gone. The brush has fallen silent. The scrolls rest in lacquered boxes or lie open on silk mats. But the Tale of Genji has just begun its second life. You pass centuries like stepping stones, watching how her story moves through time. At first it remains in court circles exclusive, handwritten, precious. A scroll copied takes weeks, months even. Some versions are decorated with paintings, the finest gold-dusted paper and hand-carved roller ends. They're not just texts, they're art, and people covet them. A princess might request a scroll for her wedding trousseau. A retired empress might read Genji beside her incense burners, weeping at a chapter she's read a dozen times. Even monks. Yes, monks keep copies hidden in temple libraries, publicly disavowing the romance while secretly analyzing the Buddhist undertones. You watch it cross borders. Through the centuries, Genji reaches military families, then merchants, then scholars in remote provinces. During the Kamakura period, warriors begin referencing it in their letters not for emotional reflection, heaven forbid, but for language practice. Imagine grizzled samurai quoting Genji in calligraphy drills. By the Muramaki era, Genji is an institution. It's studied, copied, debated. Elaborately illustrated versions like the legendary Genji Monogatari Amaki, scroll paintings, are created by master artists. Only fragments remain today, but you can still see the emotion in the brushwork delicate gestures, haunted expressions, the gold leaf shimmer of fleeting time. And then comes the Edo period. Printing technology expands, literacy spreads. The story is reborn massively. Woodblock print editions emerge. Readable, affordable. Sort of. Families own printed versions in multiple volumes. It's like the world's slowest box set. Even so, Genji isn't casual reading. It's classical Japanese, dense with references, layers of seasonal wordplay, and 1,000 poetic allusions. To fully understand it, you basically need to be a linguist, a cultural historian, and part ghost. But people try. Commentaries multiply. Schools of Genji interpretation emerge. There are arguments over the correct way to read each chapter. One scholar claims Genji represents Buddhist impermanence. Another says he's a case study in Heian narcissism. A third proposes he's an allegory for the moon. Historians still argue whether Murasaki meant any of that. And then there's the biggest mystery of all. Who was she? For all the power of her voice, Murasaki's identity remains foggy. There are no portraits, no confirmed date of birth or death, no grave with her name on it, just whispers. Over the years, people try to reconstruct her life from clues. From her diary, from her characters, from rumors. Some claim she was heartbreakingly beautiful. Others insist she was plain, bitter, and brilliant. Some say she died in a temple. Others say she died in court. A few say she never existed, that Genji was written by committee under a pseudonym. But they're missing the point, because Murasaki is Genji, and Genji is her. Not in the literal sense, but in the deeper, shadowy way that authors inhabit their stories. The way they give pieces of themselves, quietly, secretly to their characters like folded paper cranes. Every sigh in the tale, every unfinished letter, every love that fades before it blooms, that's her voice. Even centuries later, Japanese poets write back to her. In the Edo period, a famous haiku master pens a verse. Lady Murasaki, cherry blossoms still whisper your forgotten name. And then there's the Meiji period, with its mad rush toward westernization. Suddenly, ancient Japanese texts are being translated into modern forms. Genji, with its archaic grammar and poetic structure, becomes a puzzle to be unlocked and shared with the world. A Japanese translator named Suematsu Kensho, in the early 1900s, publishes the first English version of the Tale of Genji, though it's a heavily abridged one. Even so, the Western world gets its first glimpse. And the response? Mild confusion followed by awed fascination. Because Genji doesn't behave like European literature. There's no climax, no clear villain, no tidy plot. It's emotional jazz meandering, tender, devastating. It doesn't build toward resolution. It unfolds into realization. And people begin to see, this woman who lived 1,000 years ago invented something. They start calling her the world's first novelist. And maybe she was. Or maybe she wasn't. But does it matter? Because what she really invented was emotional architecture. A way to build a life out of longing and silences. Fun tidbit. There are more commentaries written on the Tale of Genji than any other work in Japanese literature. At one point, imperial examiners used it to test people's handwriting. To pass, you had to copy Genji passages beautifully enough to impress a panel of scholars with questionable taste in paper textures. Today, her presence lingers in unexpected places. There's a crater on Venus named Murasaki. An asteroid bears her name. She's featured on Japanese currency, the 2,000 yen bill no less. A quiet woman who lived behind curtains now printed on money watched over by millions. You smile, she'd hate that. Not the honor, just the attention. You wander through modern Kyoto now, where a small shrine claims to house her spirit. People visit, offer poems. A few tourists stumble in, wondering who she is. Most leave hushed. There's something sacred here. Not loud, but persistent. A voice that has crossed a millennium. You sit by the river where Uji chapters unfold, where Genji's shadow still haunts the banks. And you listen not to plot, not to poetry, but to that quiet thing underneath it all. The ache of someone who saw the world too clearly, and wrote it anyway. The rain falls lightly tonight, barely more than a hush against the paper windows. You find yourself back in Kyoto again. Not in the palace, not beside Murasaki's candle, but in a different sort of room. A lecture hall, maybe? A living room, a book club, a library. People are asking the same question you've been holding in your mind like a pebble in your palm. Did she mean to invent the novel? And the answer, like most things in Murasaki's world, isn't a clean yes or no. It's a slow smile. A gaze lowered just enough to keep you guessing. Because here's the thing. Lady Murasaki probably didn't know what a novel was. The word wouldn't exist in her language. The concept wouldn't exist in her culture. And yet, she made one. Not just a long story. Not just a love tale. But a full, immersive world built around character psychology, social nuance, emotional causality, and time. Real time. Characters age. Regret. Die. The world remembers them. That's not a scroll of anecdotes. That's a novel. So you ask yourself again, did she know? Did she sit there, brush in hand, thinking, this is something no one's ever done before? Probably not. Murasaki wasn't chasing innovation. She was chasing truth. And truth, it turns out, is the heart of every good novel. She watched the court around her and realized that the official stories, the epics, the histories, the ceremonies, left too much out. The secret glances. The fears no one said aloud. The loves that had to be rewritten in poems because plain speech was too dangerous. She didn't call it a novel, but she felt that silence needed a form, and she gave it one. And that's what makes Genji feel timeless. Not because of its structure or innovations, but because it speaks in a language of emotional resonance that hasn't aged a day. You don't read it to see what happens. You read it to understand why people do what they do, even when they don't understand themselves. Think about it. Genji isn't a hero in the traditional sense. He doesn't slay dragons. He doesn't conquer kingdoms. He fails often. He regrets. He repeats mistakes. He seeks love but wounds people in the process. He's just human. Even now, we measure good fiction by how human it feels. And Murasaki? She nailed it 1,000 years ago. Without precedent. Without models. Just observation, empathy, and an ear for silence. And yet credit comes slowly. In her own time, she was seen as talented, but not necessarily groundbreaking. Her work was shared. Revered even, but understood? Maybe not fully. Because she wasn't writing for applause. She wasn't trying to make a cultural shift. She was simply writing what she saw and what no one else dared to. Here's a modern comparison for fun. Imagine someone creating the first cinematic feature film without knowing what cinema even is. No frame of reference. No peers, just instinct. That's Murasaki. You look at the literary canon, East and West, and realize how few women are seated at the base of that pyramid. How many had their names erased, or their works attributed to men, or their brilliance labeled cleverness and nothing more. But Murasaki, she endures. Not loudly, not with monuments or fanfare, but in the soft reverence of readers who close a chapter and just sit there, staring at the paper, wondering how she captured a feeling they've never been able to name. Did she mean to do that? Did she understand that she was giving the world a template for how fiction could work? That we would still be borrowing from her? Centuries, continents, entire languages later? Probably not, but she knew what she was doing. Not in the historical sense, but in the artistic one. She knew that people need stories not to escape, but to recognize themselves. To see their grief in another person's midnight poem. To see their longing in a character's half-written letter. To see their own impermanence reflected back through the fictional lives of others. She knew we don't read to learn how things end. We read to remember what it feels like to care that they do. And that, whether she called it a novel or not, is the most modern thing a writer can do. She wasn't trying to invent a genre. She was just trying to tell the truth quietly, beautifully, behind a curtain, while everyone else talked about plum blossoms and incense. And somehow, across 1,000 years, that whisper became a canon. She left no signature. No bold claim, just a story so real it refused to die. You step outside now, into the soft drizzle of Kyoto's night. Somewhere nearby, a bookstore stocks Genji in 12 volumes. Somewhere far, a university student compares Kaoru to Hamlet. Somewhere, a woman writes her first novel and doesn't know she's walking in Murasaki's footsteps. Because that's the legacy, not invention, invitation. She wrote a world where silence was allowed to speak. And now, so many others have picked up the brush. You pause, listen. The rain has stopped. Just the quiet remains. And in that quiet, a voice still lingers. Not loud, but true. You walk once more through Kyoto, but the city feels different now, as slower, softer, almost translucent. As if the ancient capital remembers her footsteps, even if history left them unsigned. You pass under a cherry tree, its petals falling in slow, uncertain spirals. You think of Genji, of his lovers, his regrets, and the soft hush of pages turning beneath lantern light. But tonight, you're not here for him. You're here to say goodbye to her. Lady Murasaki, who slipped through history with quiet brilliance. Who turned veils into pages and heartbreak into prose, never stepped onto a stage. Never claimed a title. Yet somehow she built a literary monument that outlived dynasties. Now you return to where it all began. The Fujiwara compound, long vanished. The incense-blurred halls of the palace replaced by glass towers and vending machines. But the silence still feels familiar. If you close your eyes, you can still hear the brush scratching softly. Still feel the weight of brocade on your shoulders. Still taste the hush of a thought too dangerous to say aloud. Too beautiful not to write. Murasaki's story ends not with applause, but with dusk. You imagine her final years quiet, perhaps, but not lonely in the way people think. A woman who built entire lifetimes on paper is never truly alone. Her characters surrounded her. Her readers, even back then, kept her company. And now, so do you. You've walked her whole life with her. From curious child to reluctant courtier. From lonely widow to the mother of a literary world. You've seen her brilliance sharpened by loss, her fiction steeped in truth. You've watched her write through grief, through court boredom, through the ache of invisibility. And what remains? Not dates, not monuments, but echo. Her words are everywhere now. Whispered in poetry classes, quoted in novels, studied by scholars, translated into a dozen tongues and counting. Her tale, once penned in flickering candlelight, now glows on tablets and laptops across the globe. And the most poetic part? She never asked for any of it. She didn't publish with ambition. She didn't crave immortality. She simply wrote what no one else could. What no one else dared? She wrote the first real people in fiction. And in doing so, she wrote herself into all of us. And now here you are, on the riverbank where the Uji chapters breathe their last. The mist is low. The water whispers. Maybe, just maybe, if you listen closely, you'll hear her voice. Not loud, not certain, but true, because Murasaki's tale was never about grand endings. It was about lingering. So let her linger. Let her words stay with you, not as a name on a bill or a chapter in a textbook, but as a feeling that someone once lived, loved, watched, wept, and told the truth about it. And somehow across 1,000 years she found you. And now, let's soften things now. Imagine Kyoto again, not in the bustling present, but in deep twilight. The lanterns flicker low along the wooden corridors. The air is cool and smells faintly of plum blossoms and old paper. You're in a quiet room, safe behind woven screens where time moves like breath. Murasaki's voice has grown still, but the echo remains steady and soft, like the gentle clack of a water basin tipping in the garden. You exhale. No need to hold the details anymore. Let them fade like ink left in the rain. The scrolls are rolled up, the brush set down, the final chapter unwritten, and that's okay. Not all endings need to be finished. Some simply need to be felt. You lie back into your pillow now. Let the past fold itself around you like a silk robe. Let the whisper of Heian music play softly in the distance. Imagined flutes, imagined fans, the imagined rustle of a robe just leaving the room. You are not in a hurry. You don't need to know what happens next. Just float a little longer in the story. Let your breath slow. Let your shoulders soften. Let your thoughts loosen their grip. Because tonight you are not you. You are ink gently drying on the page.